Hello, and welcome to the first Evaluate webinar of the year, taking an in-depth look at the 2023 preview. I'm Rebecca Brooks, and I'm your host for today's session. I'm joined today by Amy Brown, who is Deputy Editor of Evaluate Vantage. Amy has extensive experience in biopharma and financial markets. Also joining her is Edwin Elmhurst, who's a data journalist with a background in biomedical science and is responsible for the data handling and analysis for Evaluate Vantage. Before we begin, there are a couple of housekeeping points to cover. The webinar should last for around 40 minutes. It is being recorded, so we will share a link to the recording along with the slides following the webinar. Please do ask questions as we go through the session. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible, and any we aren't able to answer, we'll follow up with a little later. You can ask questions through the platform via the Ask a Question section towards the bottom of your screen. If your question is for one of the speakers, please indicate this at the start. Okay, so I'll hand over to Amy and Edwin to take us through some of the key findings of the report.
Hi, thanks for joining us today for this webinar of our preview. I'm sure most of you have probably already downloaded it, so hopefully we can just pull out the salient points for you. It was written a couple of months ago now, but I think the wider environment for the sector probably hasn't changed that much. We are only a couple of weeks into the year, of course, but I think economic uncertainty, fears about interest rates rising, I don't think any of these fears have really gone away. The markets might have possibly picked up a bit in the first few weeks, or perhaps stabilising is a better word. We'll get to that at some point a bit later. But I think the message really is for those burning through cash this year, it's the start of the year in particular is going to be pretty tough. So I think Edwin is going to kick off for us with a look at some of the top-selling drugs this year.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So the first thing we're going to look at are the top-selling drugs of 2023 according to Evaluate's consensus forecasts. As Amy kind of mentioned, these numbers are as of the beginning of November last year, and it really looks like Keytruda is going to become king in 2023. It's now grown to cover about 38 settings across 18 tumor types. And as it currently stands, if you look at the data going a bit further forwards, it could well be holding this crown for some time. The sort of previous often time rulers of this analysis in other previews have been Humira. And you can see that it's starting to slip down now come 2023. It's no longer in the top spot. And it was in actual fact our individual biggest faller in top line sales. If you look ahead to the end of this month, so January 31st, we're going to begin to see the generics launching for Humira in the US. At the moment, Amgen's Amjevita is already pulling in just under $500 million sales, obviously outside of the US, as of 2022. And analysts, if you look forwards, are predicting that this will more than double in the next year or two. That being said, though, there are about 6 other biosimilars that are looking to make an entrance to the market, so it'll really depend on how that sector kind of gets carved up in the end to resolve any uncertainty around that. Other big winners from this year, which have also held sort of top spots in the previous years, are the COVID-19 products. Again, I think we'll probably see some shift in these numbers as COVID kind of transitions to becoming more of a commercial market. But we may also see some perhaps unexpected spikes in demand for them, perhaps in the near future from places like China. Overall, though, our gut feeling is kind of that these numbers are going to probably come in lower than outperform what you see on the slide here. If we move on to the next slide, we're going to start looking at things that are predicted to have the largest projected growth in 2023. So those that have the biggest jump in sales compared to their 2022 numbers. Once again, Keytruda is obviously coming out well ahead in this analysis. Whilst lung cancer accounts for about half of Keytruda's top-line sales, it is still seeing about an increase of $500 million in 2023. But there are new sales coming in from other indications like breast cancer and the sort of tumor-agnostic approvals that it's garnered. Looking a bit further down the list, you can kind of see that The incretin interacting classes are featuring pretty heavily this year as growth drivers. So this is things like the GPL-1 agonists from Ozempic and Wegovy, as well as Lilly's dual GLP-1 and GIP agonist, Mounjaro. The forecasts for Mounjaro are obviously growing pretty rapidly, and the ones that we've got here on the slides are probably already considered fairly lowball, with some of the banks now forecasting, I think it's around 3 billion in sales for 2023, which would put it up there closer to probably where Keytruda is sitting at in terms of growth. The problem that Lilly may be facing, though, to sort of reach these large forecasting numbers is capacity. But they have already been tipped to try and double their Mounjaro manufacturing capacities, but we'll have to wait and see if that manifests. We can see that AbbVie also features twice on this list, with agents looking to fill the gap left by Humira that we'd previously mentioned. But they're obviously going to have their work cut out for them, because that $22 billion hole is a pretty big one to try and fill up. These two slides are also available in the report on a company level, rather than looking at the individual product growth and top-line sales. As you might have guessed, looking at this slide, Lilly and AbbVie feature pretty heavily as the top growers in 2023. But Pfizer takes the top slot for overall largest predicted sales, and this is thanks largely to its COVID portfolio. I think I'm going to hand over to Amy now to talk a bit about the individual products to watch for that are up and coming.
Thanks. Yeah, just also a reminder that we've obviously got all the Q4 results coming up. It's the reporting season for the big pharmas, starting off with J&J's happened this week already. Next week will be big ones, and that guidance, particularly for that for the Mounjaro and the Novo products, that's going to be a big focus for a lot of investors, worried that those capacity issues might hit some of these incredibly big numbers out there at the moment. So the next slide we have for you here is the biggest potential launches. So these are drugs that are already filed with regulators. And as you can see, only not even a month into the year, we've already had quite a lot of action in this top 5. Lecanemab, now Leqembi, won accelerated approval in one of the first days of the year. Donanemab, that's Lilly's amyloid beta targeting contender for Alzheimer's, that has got a complete response letter. We are waiting for their phase 3 data. We've obviously seen the phase 3 data for Leqembi, which has been filed. I think the big question mark here is whether the FDA will make a decision on donanemab before it sees that phase 3 data. If it does decide to wait, that could feasibly put Lilly quite a few months behind Eisai and Biogen. But then you could also argue that the biggest event for this group of drugs is probably what the CMS is going to do in terms of reimbursement. I mean, their decision on Aduhelm basically meant none of these drugs will be paid for. And I think how quickly these developers can persuade this big influential payer to change its mind there is really the big swinging point for the commercial angle on this market. And how long this might be a 2024 story, but we will be following that this year. Others in the top 5, we've got Sarepta. That's a gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Probably a bit of a test case for the FDA's more kind of stricter stance on AAs, and we're going to come back to that later. But they're really trying to rein in those approvals. 9001 does have a phase 3 trial underway, and we might see data from that mid-year, so that's going to be a big readout for the sector. That's called a trial called Embark. Again, that phase 3 data is due very much around the same time that the regulator is supposed to be making a decision on the accelerated approval. Will it decide to wait? Quite possibly, I would have thought. Other projects here, Apellis, that's a hangover from last year. That got pushed back, that decision, because they filed more data, which was slightly controversial. Only one phase 3 trial hit for that project, the other one failed. So again, it's quite hard to make a call on that decision. The other thing that is slightly unusual here is that there would normally be an advisory committee here. The project, that's for geographic atrophy. This is kind of quite a developing market. We've got a lot of contenders coming through for that, but we haven't really had much approved there yet. Normally, the FDA would hold an advisory committee, but their ophthalmic committee said it wouldn't hold any panels remotely in the pandemic. If they suddenly decide to start holding in-person panels again, perhaps it'll get caught in that net. So we'll wait to see there. And then finally, RSV, big battleground this year. Pfizer's got a PDUFA date just after GSK. And we are also then, they both go to the CDC's vaccine advisory committee for reimbursement decisions. I think the expectation there is that both will get reimbursed, and then that will play out in the market. But we're also waiting to see quite a lot of durability data from these vaccines. We haven't had a vaccine against RSV before. So how long they kind of last will make a big impact on actually how big that market is commercially. So the next slide we have for you is projects coming slightly behind. Top one there. This is the ADC that Astra paid $1 billion for, so quite a lot of pressure there for the data that's emerging. BIOPHARMA'S is a TROP2 targeting ADC. This first trial we're going to see is in second-line non-small cell lung cancer. The checkpoint inhibitors have only relatively recently become standard of care in first line there. So what the second line what second line patients look like is still not entirely clear. So it's quite hard to handicap that results. We've got a big article out on that on our website, having a much closer look at that if anyone is interested. Coming behind that, Intellia and the Regeneron. This is a gene editing project. The FDA hasn't actually allowed clinical trials to start in the US on this project. Intellia said the other day that they are going to file an IND mid-2023. FDA has been incredibly cautious about gene editing approaches. There's quite a lot of clinical holds active here. We've got the Verve one. That's a PCSK9 targeted gene therapy, gene edited, sorry. Graphite blew up this year when the patient developed kind of pancytopenia, which is prolonged low blood count. So not the sort of thing you want to be seeing in the side effect profiles of these drugs, which in many ways probably won't be reversed. So the progress of Intellia and all the other gene editing stocks, big stories to watch this year. Those two slides are just a top 5. We have a top 10 in the preview, so download that for a closer look at the ones that come behind that section. And I think we are going to move on to a look at the regulatory environment, which Edwin has been looking at.
Yeah, thanks. So what we have on screen here is the accelerated approvals, but I think before we talk about those, it's probably worth briefly touching on a more top-line look at the FDA's novel approvals in 2022 and 3. So in 2022, the FDA across CBER and CEDAR approved 42 assets over the year. And this was kind of coming in below the 10-year average of about 48 and well under the pretty impressive 58 approvals they got in 2021. Despite the fact there was obviously a global pandemic ongoing. But there were delays in at least 6 projects, and this included Apellis' project, which Amy had just mentioned. And they have all been sort of pushed back into this year, which means that while 2022 may actually just look a little bit worse than it was, the shortfall could be made up in 2023. In the report, there is our prediction using the Evaluate Omnium data that we think about 57 NMEs might get greenlit this year as novel approvals by the FDA. Where the FDA has certainly clamped down recently, as we can see in the slide here, is the accelerated approval pathway. So the 2022 data here runs to September. That's when the FDA last released that data. And you can see that only 9 projects got approved this way. This is a considerable drop from the previous couple of years. And the FDA has not only sort of raised the bar for those that are sort of aspiring to apply through this pathway by requiring assets to already have confirmatory trials underway, But products which have then gone on to fail their confirmatories are also being pulled from the market now. So relatively recently, that includes GSK's Blenrep. But the sort of clamping down we're seeing on these accelerated approvals is probably going to have the most impact on smaller companies, particularly now that funding is much harder to come by. The requirement that you need to start a phase 3 before filing means that you're obviously going to need a much longer cash runway, which may well result in a few less projects coming out. But, you know, if these projects then have a better chance of actually reaching the market, is that really such a bad thing? I think next thing we're going to talk about is going to be the money markets and M&A. And I think I'm handing back to Amy for this one.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is the next section in our preview. And I think we're going to start off with the result of the poll that we ran. It's the first time we did this. We had over 150 responders to it. And first question, which is probably what a lot of people are wondering at the moment, has the US biotech market hit the bottom? I think this the response is there. Perhaps you could say makes encouraging reading. Most people thought it had already happened. I think if you look at the markets, that perhaps supports this. The XBI, that's an exchange-traded fund that tracks a lot of smaller biotechs. That kind of, I guess it looks like it bottomed out mid-2022, kind of flatlined since then. Might have picked up slightly in the opening days of the year. Although I think if it is a recovery, it's still pretty shaky. So the next slide looks a bit more closely at the companies that did do well and did badly last year. This is from our 2022 review report, which will be coming out hopefully next week. So this analysis is also available on our website at the moment. So we track almost 700 globally listed biopharma stocks over the year, just pure play drug developers. We split them into these market cap cohorts at the beginning of the year. We've been tracking these over the year, and you can see that it's pretty much terrible for everybody until that fourth quarter. Big rebound in the large cap developers we saw. I think there is a general flight to safety across the markets, not just in biotech. But there was also a couple of sector specific factors that lifted it. Obviously, we had Amgen's buyout of Horizon and Zantac litigation risk that seems to have been put to bed from the first hearing we heard out in the US. I think that was in November. But as you can see, the small and mid caps had the first uplift for a while in the Q4. I mean, it's as I said earlier, it's probably a bit too early to call this a recovery, but perhaps we can say that a floor has been hit. What does this mean for IPOs? If we have a look at the next slide, that's again, this is our full 2022 numbers now. This is also on our website. I mean, you can see it was the IPO market was completely obliterated last year, really. And again, this is all sectors. It's not just biotech. No one can float at the moment, really. Most of those that did go out last year were small, and they haven't done very well since, probably because they couldn't raise enough money. And what does everyone think is going to happen this year? So if we look at the next slide, which has the result of our poll question on this, you can see hopes are for a slightly better year this year. Quite a lot of people also think it'll be about the same. So there's obviously not huge optimism here. But I think it's probably people think it could be quite hard to be worse than 2022. The next slide is the other question we asked. This is just for Europe. I mean, only one developer went out in 2022 in Europe, so I don't think that situation could get much worse. And the next slide is a slight segue off the IPO topic. The impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is now in law in the US, is going to be a huge focus for the sector for the coming year. It's quite hard to know what's going to happen. But one of the big complaints of the sector is that its innovation will be impacted, particularly small molecules. I think critics contend that the new law makes small molecule investment less attractive than those in biotech products, because the former can obviously be selected for this price negotiation sooner. We thought if this is really a true fear, it will show up in the data at some point. So we looked at historical IPOs by technology, and you can see that over the last 5 years, it was pretty much 50-50. This is probably also a fairly good proxy for venture capital investments. Most IPOs are venture capital backed. So we will be keeping an eye on this as 2023 progresses to see if that shifts. So the next look at the data is venture capital data. I mean, I think there's no question here that the purse strings are being tightened. And again, this is not a biotech phenomenon. I don't think anyone expects these numbers to go up this year. The question is probably how much it will drop. We still at very historically high levels of investment here. I mean, I don't think there's kind of huge concerns here that all the private companies are going to run out of money. But I think we're going to see down rounds this year, sideways rounds. And there's going to be a lot of support of existing portfolio companies. And the final topic here we have for you is M&A. This is obviously, you can see this is full year 2022 data now, again, available on our website. Really picked up in Q4, although the vast majority of that was the 28 billion Horizon deal. It's a lot of money, still technically a bolt-on deal. And I think that's what everyone expects to see more of this year. Capital is getting more expensive. So even for these cash-rich, large developers, big deals are becoming harder to justify. The trend is certainly to streamline and focus pipelines rather than add scale for scale's sake. So bolt-ons does seem to be the way a lot of the sector is going. But of course, we are going to probably see more distressed sales. The power is certainly in the buyer's camp at the moment, particularly if a deal is not particularly competitive. And you have seen this already in the deals that have emerged this year. CVRs are back. Sellers are being forced to take on that future risk. So that is certainly a trend that we will be watching. Of course, the burning question is who might be bought next? And the final slide we have for you is the result of our poll. You can see we can strike Horizon off that list. That happened shortly after we conducted it. CGen, I would say that looks fairly doubtful now. That will be a very expensive buy. And I think if they couldn't buy a buyer when it must have been on the block last year, it probably raises questions whether anyone was that serious. The other companies here, Vertex, Biogen, Argenx, there's lots of reasons for companies to buy them, but whether big companies are willing to deploy this sort of cash, I think that's an important question. You know, the M&A markets also hate uncertainty, and there is a lot of economic uncertainty out there at the moment. So perhaps more interest in those smaller names, Karuna perhaps, these sort of names where it would be definitely classed more of a bolt-on. And with that was all our prepared remarks, and I think hopefully we've got some questions to answer.
Great. Thank you both for your insights. Yes, we've had a number of questions coming in, so I think we'll get straight into these. Amy, I'm going to direct the first one to you. Other than Alzheimer's, what are the biggest clinical trials reading out this year?
Well, yes, the Alzheimer's ones obviously will be a big focus. The TROP2 readout from the ADC we mentioned. And the TIGIT class, this is supposedly the next big IO immuno-oncology mechanism that everyone's watching. I think hopes have come down a lot for this mechanism after the Roche tiragolumab. That's disappointing in a couple of trials, but we've got another overall survival readout from Skyscraper 01. I think Roche has said unless that passes futility, they won't. I don't think they're going to announce that, and then it will go to a final analysis due later this year. So I think no news is probably bad news there. We've also got another couple of TIGIT. Domvanalimab, I think I pronounced that right, is the Gilead Arcus TIGIT. That might be mid-year, along with the Merck asset, whose name escapes me. That's a non-small cell lung cancer trial as well. That also might be at ASCO. So ASCO this year is going to be interesting. This might be the TIGIT year for ASCO. Outside of oncology, I think I mentioned Karuna there in the M&A. They've got their final phase 3 readout. That's already impressed in a couple of phase 3 trials, and we're waiting for the final data to let them file. I believe that's mid-year. So that will be one to watch. Cardiology, Cytokinetics, I know they've got a big readout from a trial called Sequoia. That's aficamten for cardiomyopathy. That's another big market with a lot of competitors. That's also tipped as a takeover target, so that's probably another one to keep an eye on. But I think, yeah, that's those ones immediately spring to mind.
Great. Okay, next question for you, Edwin. Do we know which companies might be most affected by the price negotiations in the US?
Oh, that's quite a long way in the future for most of that. I think if we concentrate on the nearest catalyst for the IRA, I guess, which is September 1st this year, where they're going to announce the first 10 drugs that will be selected for negotiation, that's probably easier to make a bit more of a call on. So those will be those that are in the Part D listing. I think that for 2023, when we looked at this data before, the drug that comes in at the top, obviously, of Part D spending is Bristol's Eliquis. But from what I remember, sort of quite a few analysts that cover this drug have said that the pricing point for this is already fairly low and competitive. So I think that the impact on BMS will really depend on how tough the negotiations want to be, or if it's even seen as a worthwhile thing to chase. Other companies which feature heavily on this, AbbVie has at least 2 products that are sort of meeting all the criteria for negotiation, which certainly includes Imbruvica. And I think Creon is the other one. I think Venclexta is still a couple of years out from being viable for negotiation. There are certainly a couple of companies whose products make up a good proportion of their sort of predicted future sales, I think. So Tagrisso for AstraZeneca is currently, according to consensus, their biggest forecaster come 2028. But that drug obviously meets all the criteria for negotiated lower prices. I think when we looked at it, the real big one that jumped out for us as a surprise is Ingrezza for Neurocrine. That could be a real gut shot to that company, as it is definitely qualifying to be negotiated over, but it comprises 80% of their sales, I think, at least in 2026, which is when this would all come into sort of action and the reductions would become applicable. I think those are the only that I can really think of at the moment, at least for the most immediate future, yeah.
Okay, and following on from that, the next question, how quickly do you think we'll start seeing the impact of the IRA on pipelines this year, or will companies take more of a wait-and-see approach? Who would like to take that?
Well, since I'm already talking about it, I guess I can keep going. I mean, same as I prephrased the previous question, I think this is quite a long way out from having any impact, and it's kind of hard to call at the moment. A few companies have already started blaming the impacts or potential impacts of the IRA on a few pipeline decisions. Cynically, you might say it could also be a convenient excuse for some portfolio decisions that might be made. I think before we see any real impacts on R&D spend or project prioritizations or cash allocations, etc., we'll probably need to see how aggressive these negotiations turn out to be and where exactly they fall in that list. And this will be obviously a few years out yet before we can determine all those things. So I think we at Vantage will probably leave it at least another 12 months before we start taking a look at any more specifics around this? I don't know if you have any opinions on this, Amy.
Yeah, I think we've kind of decided that in terms to actually be able to see it in the data, it will take, we probably wouldn't look at that until we've got 12 months of kind of evidence amassing from decisions. But as Edwin said, it's going to be very hard to separate the real impact from, and perhaps, I don't know if an excuse is the right word, but yes, I mean, there's many reasons why people put money into certain assets, but yes, it certainly gives companies another reason to deprioritise, or at least that's what they were saying.
Okay, next question for Amy. Are SPACs still a thing?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we still see them float, which I find quite surprising. But I think the track record of the companies that have come to market via SPAC has been pretty poor. I mean, you could also say the same thing about a lot of IPOs as well. So perhaps that's not entirely fair comment. I think, but there is a lot of suspicion about the quality of companies that these vehicles deliver. The same probably for the reverse mergers as well, which we're probably going to see more of this year. I mean, there's always exceptions. I think Point Biopharma, the radioligand group, they've done very well. They're in quite a hot space. Cerevel, they're a competitor to Karuna, actually. They're probably worth watching this year, see how they progress. That was a SPAC. And Roivant, of course, one of the biggest that we've seen. So, yeah, it's quite hard. I think they were a real function of a lot of money flowing around the whole financial sector, and I think that money isn't there as much anymore. So I think, are they still a thing? Probably not. I mean, I don't think they're going to disappear, but I think they're going to certainly fade away. I think another reason they faded away, of course, was because of this. The SEC kind of really fired a couple of shots across the bows. They were very concerned about transparency, conflict of interest, and it's actually quite interesting that the SEC seems to have turned to the venture sector this year, which is probably also something to watch. And what they're concerned there, again, they have cited concerns about lack of transparency, conflict of interest, which kind of really echo what they did with SPACs. They're putting together a new law that would make it easier to sue investors for negligence, basically. So make the venture capital funds culpable for the failure of startups, which, I mean, obviously the venture world hates this and is fighting it, but it's certainly something to watch this year. I think Politico reported earlier this month that the SEC was putting final touches on the language. I mean, I think it's probably more of a reaction to the scandals in the tech space, perhaps, with all the crypto blow-ups. But, you know, the extent to this might have read through to biotech. This is something that we are going to have to explore this year. That was a bit of a segue, sorry. But I guess the SPAC market does provide a route if you can't IPO. And I think if the IPOs come back strongly, I think that will be another reason for SPACs not to come back. And I think you were looking at the IPO queue the other day, actually, Edwin, weren't you? Is there much coming through?
Yeah. So, I mean, I certainly don't think we can call it a comeback. Definitely not yet, because this is, after all, queue, and it's not unknown for things to be pulled from the queue and decide they're not going to go ahead as the environment doesn't suit them. But there are a handful. I think we've actually had one IPO complete this year already. January the 3rd, we had Coya Therapeutics. It was a small one, as many last year were as well, at 15 million. I think they're into regulatory T-cell therapies, their area. But of the 4 or 5 in the queue, there are a couple that have filed to potentially fairly big IPOs. So Structure Therapeutics, a phase 1 obesity and diabetes developer, they filed for a 100 million raising in the IPO, as did Mineralis Therapeutics. They're currently in phase 2 for cardiorenal disorders. Those are the 2 biggies in the queue at the moment. Although I think, as a bit of a side note, you can kind of mention Kenvue, so J&J's consumer health spin-out is in the queue for IPO, although they've got a bit of a placeholder. I was reading some of sort of Renaissance Capital analysts' take on it, and they think that they could be raising $5 billion when they float. But being a consumer health unit, they probably wouldn't make our normal cut of the data, as we tend to focus on developers.
Yeah, I mean, the developer that's the obesity player, I mean, they are obviously going to be kind of riding on the coattails of the success of Mounjaro and that sort of class. There's a huge interest in the obesity, the metabolism area, and I think if any younger developer is going to be able to attract investment this year, I think there'll probably be a lot of investors looking to get into that space. So that is certainly something to watch this year.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Edwin, I'm going to direct this one to you. If you were investing in one indication, what would you pick?
Yeah, I think I want to jump on this one. I might just be scuppering what Amy might say. I guess the first thing we probably have to clarify is that we are in no way qualified to give any investment advice whatsoever. But I guess I've looked at enough of the data. I probably can talk about the indications that are sort of seeming to be in growth or going to experience future growth. On the shorter term, diabetes, as we've gone through this slide deck, Ozempic, Mounjaro, the other GLP-1 agonists, they're going to see pretty immediate growth, as are, there's continued growth in non-small cell lung cancer and breast cancer from the PD-L1s. Breast cancer in particular, you're getting CDK inhibitors, and the HER2s going to grow nicely this year. Longer term, the data says we may see the promised year of NASH, which we've been talking about for a while, I think. Ozempic and Madrigal's TRB agonist are due to launch, but we've talked about NASH in previous years. We'll see if that comes to pass. A few of the gene therapies, so for EB and Sarepta's DMD gene therapy obviously launching, but I think to steal what Amy's just said and make her job harder, obesity is kind of a long-term growth prospect that's looking fairly good between now and 2028, at least according to our data. Amy, you got a pick that I haven't just nicked?
No, not really. No, I agree. They're definitely the growth areas. I mean, I guess you could also talk about the orphan exclusions of the IRA. I think if you're an orphan drug, you're not open to price negotiation. So, but I think you're only allowed one orphan indication. I think, correct me if I'm wrong there, Edwin, which means...
I think your only indication, yes, it's one and only indication is an orphan indication.
Yeah.
Okay, for our final question, what has to happen for the IPO window to open again? Amy, I'll direct that one at you.
Well, I think probably we've covered a lot of the factors there. I mean, I think it's kind of macro really, rather than sector specific. I think inflation risk fears have to subside. Ideally, a certain war in Europe will end. All of those things would help equity markets pick up. I mean, I would be in another job if I could predict that. But I mean, I think at some point some companies are going to have to go out. Venture capital is only set up to support companies for a certain amount of time. I mean, this probably brings in private equity. Private equity they've got a lot of dry powder. Everybody always tells me they're desperate to put it to work. They've massively grown their teams in life sciences over the last couple of years, bought venture firms. I mean, I don't think they're going to start leaping in, making acquisitions, company buyouts of early stage companies, but you could certainly see a ramp up in the clinical co-development deals that they've been exploring. maybe they will step in if the IPO window doesn't open this year as widely as everybody is expecting. But yeah, at some point something's got to give, because people will need growth capital, and perhaps it will just be trundling along at lower levels for another 12, perhaps 24 months.
Okay, so that's all we've got time for today. Thank you, Amy and Edwin. Thank you to everyone who joined us today and for submitting your questions. We'll be in touch to answer any that we didn't manage to cover in the discussion. If you'd like to speak to us further, please drop a note into the Q&A. We'll reach out to you shortly. And we will be sending a full recording of the webinar rounds with a link to download the slides and also to access the report. So please do keep an eye out. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Evaluate webinar. Thank you very much.